Well, welcome back for another OSHA Quick Take. I'm Scott Cuthbert, co-founder of Safepedia, and with me from Conn, Maciel, Carey is Kate McMahon and Beeta Lashkari. All right, so I'll just turn it over to Kate and Beeta to do quick introductions.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Scott. And thanks to Safepedia for the great work you guys do. It's tremendous, and we're glad to partner with you guys. We are excited about the upcoming webinar on combustible dust. Just as a little background, I'm Kate McMahon at Conn, Maciel, Carey, and myself, along with my colleague and right hand everything, Beeta Lashkari, will be joining me to do the webinar on combustible dust. My background is sort of very broad in the occupational safety and health field, and I represent clients in many different industries. The fun part is to help them build best practices and ensure that they're in compliance. That we also handle, sort of the tough stuff, the bad days when there's an accident or an incident, or even an employee complaint about a hazard. And we help the employer sort of navigate through that. And so that's part of what our practice is. I work with Beeta in a lot of areas, including in the area of combustible dust. And I want to just say, because I know she won't say herself, Beeta is really our law firm's true expert on combustible dust. Beeta is a former attorney investigator for the CSB, the Chemical Safety Board, whose mission is to investigate and develop recommendations associated with terribly catastrophic explosions, many of which are from combustible dust. So we've got some real expertise in-house, and I'm so lucky to have Beeta with me in this practice. So Beeta, do you want to give an introduction to yourself as well?
Oh gosh, I'm so humbled. Thank you so much, Kate. But yeah, so my name is Beeta Lashkari, as Kate mentioned, before joining Conn, Maciel, Carey, and I'm an associate at Conn, Maciel, Carey. I was an attorney investigator at the Chemical Safety Board. And just as Kate mentioned, the CSB has investigated many combustible dust incidents. It's part of the agency's advocacy priorities. So really happy to assist clients proactively to mitigate this hazard and to tackle it. And certainly do a lot of work in that area, and very glad my sentiments go out, thousandfold, millionfold towards Kate. So very happy to be partnering with Kate on this really important project.
We're going to kick things off with Beeta. And what is combustible gas or dust? Sorry.
Sure. Yep. No problem, Scott. So so broadly, combustible dust are sort of fine particles that present an explosion hazard when they're suspended in air under certain conditions. So we typically think of the fire triangle with, the three sides of the triangle being fuel, ignition, and oxygen. So with a dust explosion, we add sort of two more sides to that triangle, making an explosion pentagon. And those two extra sides are confinement and dispersion. So most solid organic materials, as well as many metal and some non-metallic inorganic materials, they'll burn or explode if they're finely divided and then dispersed in sufficient concentrations. So, and it's even, really seemingly really small amounts of accumulated dust can cause really catastrophic damage. So, and when I say, small amounts, it's even as little as there's this, one of the NFPA applicable NFPA standards uses 1/32 of an inch, sort of over 5% of a room surface area. And just to put 1/32 of an inch in just perspective, that's like the thickness of a paper clip. Dust explosions can be either primary or secondary. A primary dust explosion occurs when a dust suspension within a container or room or piece of equipment, some confined space, is ignited and explodes. A secondary explosion occurs when dust that's accumulated on floors or other surfaces like rafters is lofted and then ignited by that primary explosion. So, depending on the extent of the dust deposits, a seemingly weak, primary explosion can cause a very, very powerful secondary explosion. And just to make this point, I think it's really important. An important one is, combustible dust hazards are sort of present in a broad spectrum of industries. That includes like food, we've seen sugar dust, grain, tobacco, plastics, wood, paper, pulp, rubber, pesticide, pharmaceutical dyes, coal, metal industries. So I think there's a lot of misconception about what kinds of dusts are combustible, but it does exist in a broad array of industries.
Great. Yeah, I didn't realize that myself, but that's good to know. So Kate, does OSHA have a combustible dust standard?
No, Scott, it does not for general industry anyway. It does have one industry specific standard that addresses combustible dust, and that's for the grain handling industry. At 1910-272, the standards are set forth for combustible dust in grain handling. But for the rest of the industries, all the industries that Beeta just mentioned, there is not a regulatory standard that applies to combustible dust. The agency has kind of a interesting history on the development of a combustible dust standard. It is not that it's lost on them. They did start down, the effort to make the rulemaking, the long rulemaking road to make a combustible dust standard in 2009, over a decade ago. But the agency has not gotten to the stage yet of a proposed rule. The next stage in this rulemaking that did get started around 2009 was the SBREFA process. That's where small business gets to weigh in on a standard kind of early on, a preliminary draft standard. But that SBREFA process was postponed several times. And in fact, in 2017, in the spring regulatory agenda, OSHA withdrew the rulemaking process or proposal to create a combustible dust standard in general industry, indicating that there were resource constraints and other priorities. I think one of the issues that we understand OSHA faced is this is a very challenging rule to promulgate. For one of the reasons is, as Beeta was describing, and by the way, Beeta, my colleague, is a true expert in the area of combustible dust, having worked at the Chemical Safety Board, at the agency that is designed to investigate these sorts of explosion hazards. And so as an attorney investigator there, he has lots of experience and really has a tremendous knowledge base in the area. So we're really lucky to have Beeta with our law firm to help us through navigate, combustible dust issues, because even though OSHA doesn't have a combustible dust compliance standard, it does have and has been very focused on combustible dust enforcement actions. It has a national emphasis program on combustible dust, which it uses regularly to inspect facilities and to issue citations, or that ultimately may result in the issuance of a citation, either under the general duty clause, OSHA's 5A1 standard, or a myriad of specific standards. We've seen enforcement actions under not only general duty, but the walking working surfaces standard, which includes housekeeping requirements, material handling and storage standards. There have been housekeeping violations issued for storage areas. There's also the ventilation standard, PPE standards, electrical standards, PIT standards, even safety signage standards, HAZCOM standards, the egress standard, fire prevention standard. And so OSHA does have enforcement teeth on combustible dust, even though it doesn't have its own standard. Just to give you a little background on stats here, in 2018, the wood and food products industries made up about, on average, 70% of the materials involved in combustible dust fires and explosions. And incident reports indicate that the majority of the industries involved in combustible dust hazards are wood processing, ag and food production, lumber production. But that doesn't mean there aren't others. We've seen others. So I just want to emphasize the importance of addressing and dealing with combustible dust. And also, note for those of you who may be in these industries, OSHA revamped their emphasis program earlier this year in January 2023 and set forth a new approach for locating and inspecting subject establishments. So commercial bakeries, print ink manufacturing, cut stock, resawing lumber, leather and hide tanning and finishing, truss manufacturing, and grain and field bean merchant wholesaler industries were added to the Combustible Dust National Emphasis Program based on OSHA finding a higher likelihood of combustible dust hazards in those industries or having experienced combustible dust fatalities or catastrophes. So since 2007, about 600 inspections annually are conducted under this NEP. If you're in one of those industries, it is really imperative to not lose sight of this. Dust, to my mind, is probably the most challenging, in some ways, the most challenging hazard that you face in your industry because it seems innocuous. Beeta was mentioning is the thickness of a paperclip. It seems like it is no big deal. And I've been in plenty of manufacturing facilities where there's just dust from the manufacturing operations, right? Or from outside or wherever. It doesn't take much to cause a major catastrophic incident. So heed the warning to be focused on this. And that's what we're going to talk about when we do our webinar.
Yeah, that's some great advice. And so Beeta, how does OSHA use its general duty clause authority to issue citations and combustible for combustible dust hazards?
Yeah, it's a great question, Scott. So really it does it by referencing NFPA standards. I know I alluded to those earlier, but NFPA standards, one of the main ones that comes to mind is NFPA 654, which is called, the standard for prevention of fire and dust explosions from the manufacturing, processing, and handling of combustible particulate solids. So for OSHA to prove a violation of a general duty clause under the general duty clause, and this is for any type of general duty clause citation, but it has to prove 4 elements. One, that the employer failed to keep the workplace free of a hazard to which employees were exposed. Number 2 being that the hazard was recognized. Number 3, the hazard was causing or was likely to cause death or serious injury, and 4, that there were feasible and useful methods to correct the hazard. So in the NEP that Kate was describing, OSHA states that a citation under the general duty clause may be issued for fires, deflagrations, and explosion hazards that may be caused by combustible dust, sort of within a dust collection system or other equipment, including things like mixers, dryers, silos, bucket elevators, or mills. And it states, and I'm quoting here, it says, the NFPA standards, which represent the opinions of experts familiar with combustible dust hazards, are useful in providing evidence of industry recognition of the hazard. So that's element number 2, and potential feasible means of abatement. So that's element number 4. So really, it's that referencing that the NFPA standards are sort of like a hook, and that sort of provides some basis for OSHA to issue general duty clause citations for the hazard.
Good. So Kate, the $1 million question is, what should employers do to mitigate the hazards and reduce enforcement risks?
Okay, so what I want to say is call Beeta, but aside from that, or in addition to that, follow NFPA standards. Beeta just described, we don't have an OSHA regulatory standard. We do have guidance. They're not, NFPA does not have enforcement authority, but as Beeta just described, OSHA can use the general duty clause to essentially enforce NFPA standards. So it's critical that you follow NFPA standards that apply to your industry. Now, I will warn you, the NFPA standards are lengthy, they're complex, they have a lot of requirements. At a minimum, to not scare, the audience, basically, in a nutshell, employers need to identify whether the dust in their facilities is in fact combustible or explosible. And the way that's done is through testing. So you take samples and, experts exist that can help you decide how to know how to do, sample correctly. Experts are available to do testing. Y'all can learn it yourselves as well. Beeta has lots of resources available, but basically you sample your dust, you test it to see if it is explosible or combustible. If it's not, you're good, and you keep a record of that. If it is, you need to start what's called a DHA, a dust hazard analysis. It's a long process, but basically it's essentially a systemic review to identify and evaluate. Once we know there's combustible or explosible dust in your facility, you identify and evaluate the potential for fires, flash fires, or explosions. And then once those hazards are identified, the DHA essentially develops recommendations on how to control those hazards, including, this is stuff that'd be familiar to safety professionals, engineering and administrative controls, PPE, housekeeping measures, those sorts of things. And those are outlined in the DHA. And then you implement your DHA and you've made your facility a much, much safer place from a combustible dust standpoint.
Great.
So that's it.
Yeah, that's it. It does not sound overly simple. So I think we'll definitely encourage everybody to tune into the full webinar on December 7th. Again, I think it's 1 p.m. Eastern. And Conn, Maciel, Carey, Beeta, and Kate will do a deep dive and walk you through through these combustible dust issues in a lot more detail. So thank you guys so much for joining today. Really appreciate it. And definitely encourage everybody to sign up for the webinar on December 7th.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you all.
See you in December. Bye-bye.